Hello, today we have Professor Alfred de Zayas, and it's an honor and privilege to have such an expert in conversation today. Professor de Zayas, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Professor Alfred de Zayas is an internationally renowned expert on international law. He's the professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Formerly, he spent many years working as the top United Nations expert on international law and order. He's a Harvard graduate. Don't hold that against him, and he spent many years traveling the world, studying various conflicts and giving his expert opinion on. So it's a pleasure to have Professor de Zayas with us today.
Thank you again. I thought of mentioning that before being UN independent expert on international order, I was the head of the petitions department in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which means I was the registrar. All the petitions ran through my desk. And that is something that enables me to present a petition, to present a communication to the International Criminal Court, asking for an investigation of Ursula von der Leyen for complicity. But of course, it's not just my initiative, it's a civil society initiative. A very good Irishman, Jonathan O'Connor, of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute, and many others have collaborated in this project. And also our French colleagues, our friends of the French collective of jurists under Pierre-Emmanuel Dupont. I mean, we have to give credit where credit is due. And he is the main drafter of this legal brief, which we presented to the International Criminal Court, to Karim Khan, 2 weeks ago on the 25th of May, when I was, by the way, in Holland. My wife is Dutch, and we have a place very close to The Hague. As the case may be, this is a civil society initiative, and I want to encourage other non-governmental organizations, other peace movements, other individuals to make use of Article 15 of the Statute of Rome and submit cases to the International Criminal Court. Let me be clear. An individual cannot submit a case to the International Court of Justice, which also has its seat in The Hague. But an individual can send information to the prosecutor and tell the prosecutor, look, here are the facts. Okay. Do something about it. And it's within his mandate.
Professor de Zayas, let me take a couple of steps back for viewers and listeners that are maybe not aware of this major development that you're talking about. You're part of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute, an international collective of jurists and human rights experts. You have, in the last week or so, on the 25th of May, as you said, you've formally submitted a request, a legal brief to the International Criminal Court to investigate the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for prosecution for complicity in genocide and war crimes in Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories perpetrated by the Israeli state. This is a major development. You're calling for the head of the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen, to be investigated for war crimes prosecution. Can you?
Well, not only her, basically, many other officials of the European Commission are just as responsible, because they have engaged in advocating, endorsing, promoting military, economic, financial, political, propagandistic support of Israel, which is conducting a genocide and has been conducting ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians for 75 years. It's just now that people focus on the atrocities being committed by Israel in Gaza, but people don't seem to remember that this war didn't start on the 7th of October. This war actually started back in 1947 and 48 with the Nakba, with the first ethnic cleansing of 1 million Palestinians way back when. And the European Commission, since its inception, has been very pro-Israel. And they continue business as usual. They continue their financial support of Israel, financial transactions, commercial transactions with Israel, etc. That is what has to be stopped. Right. And because Ursula von der Leyen is a public official, and she has a responsibility not only as a German, but she has a responsibility as a person who must respect the Treaty of Lisbon, Article 2, which deals with human rights, and human rights are being violated massively in Gaza. But what we intended to do as a civil society organization was to alert the public. Look, here you have the European Commission giving aid and comfort, aiding and abetting a genocide, and this is being whitewashed by the mainstream media. So what did we do? We sent an open letter to Ursula von der Leyen earlier this year, no answer. We sent a follow-up to that open letter and said, we are going to bring a case before the International Criminal Court unless you stop this military, political, diplomatic support of Israel. And in the absence of action from Charles Michel, Josep Borrell, and Ursula von der Leyen, we finally took the step and submitted a 29-page legal brief. And it is pursuant to Article 15 in the hands of Karim Khan to do something or to do nothing at all. If we make this very public, people are aware that there is a case against Ursula von der Leyen, against the European Commission in the International Criminal Court, people might start thinking differently about them. As I said, it's a question of perception. It's a question of the information war that has to be won, because the public relations of the European Commission, and in particular, the public relations on behalf of Ms. von der Leyen, has to be broken. And that is one of the things that we intend to do with this case, and we will not let go.
Because there is a sense, Professor de Zayas, of kind of untouchable. These people are untouchable. They're, they act with impunity. They're above the law, and as you say, there's a perception problem in the public that we can't do anything about these officials to hold them account. Of course, your initiative is a brilliant breakthrough in that you're tearing down that facade of people being untouchable, and of course, how can they even presume to be so? But it has become a chronic problem where these people feel that they are so elitist and above the law that they have become so arrogant. Your initiative is really going to throw some really cold water on top of these people to shake them up. And do you think, Professor, that the other European national leaders could also be investigated for complicity in the war crimes in Gaza? I'd say, for example, the British leader Rishi Sunak. Britain is a major arms supplier of the Israeli state, as with Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Are these people also liable for investigation, as you're initiating with Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission leaders?
Of course they are. And of course they are complicit. If the investigation goes forward, they would have to issue arrest warrants against these people. I should remind the listeners that Article 27 of the Statute of Rome is very clear. Public leaders, public officials, civil servants have no functional immunity. It's expressly written in Article 27, which means that Sunak, Macron, Scholz could not say, we're not guilty, we have immunity, etc., etc. They do not. And of course, the United States is the main culprit here. The United States has not only provided the weapons with which the genocide is being conducted, the United States has given, shall we say, diplomatic and financial support to Israel, is completely complicit in the genocide, and knowingly so. We, in our brief, we go into the issue of intent, the issue of the mens rea, the fact that we know very well what we are doing, and we're doing it notwithstanding. So I think that if we succeed in, as the students are doing now in the universities, in bringing this matter to public debate, that people say we need an immediate ceasefire, as I demonstrated 50 years ago against the Vietnam War. And ultimately we prevailed. Ultimately, the United States realized that it lost the war and it had to leave with its tail between its legs, the same as it happened in Afghanistan. In the meantime, of course, millions of Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians were killed, but we demonstrated against, and I am optimistic, because when I've seen the enormous demonstrations we had here at the University of Geneva, at the University of Lausanne, I mean, young people have woken up. Young people are no longer believing the fantasies in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and in CNN, et cetera, et cetera. They are listening to the alternative media. And I think it's very important, and just watch it, how the alternative media has been growing by leaps and bounds. People want to have real news. People don't want to have the propaganda that the New York Times, as the echo chamber of the Pentagon, as the echo chamber of the State Department, that's not what they want to read. They want to read real analysis.
Yeah. Professor de Zayas, I mean, you're a formidable proponent of international law. I mean, let's keep it simple here. I mean, all you're advocating is for everybody to respect and abide by international law. I mean, it couldn't be more simple. And secondly, you know, you've mentioned about the fake news. Your other book is countering mainstream narratives.
Yes.
The point of that, well, one of the points is that, you know, democracy is impossible unless people have access to accurate information. I mean, if they're completely overwhelmed with propaganda and false narratives, as the mainstream media propagate, then it's impossible for a democracy to function. It's impossible for international law to function, because people then do not have the correct perspective on doing things like prosecuting the head of the European Commission or the United States president, for that matter. Professor de Zayas, so though you did mention the word if your initiative, if your formal request for investigation into Ursula von der Leyen goes ahead, you've submitted it, your request. The Geneva International Peace Research Institute has submitted this very admirable legal brief to the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor there, Karim Khan. Now, the stumbling block here is he could decide not to take the case further.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he already, at the beginning of his mandate, I was very disappointed with him because his predecessor, Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor before him, had started an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And one of the first things that Karim Khan does is he discontinues the investigation into U.S. crimes, but continues the investigation into war crimes by the Taliban. I mean, that was immediately criticized by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, and a whole slew of other human rights institutions that said, you can't do that. I mean, you cannot tolerate double standards. There's no free lunch for the Western countries. The Western countries are just as much capable of committing war crimes, and they are susceptible to being investigated and punished for war crimes. Because, for instance, already the first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, then Fatou Bensouda, and now him, there have been legal briefs submitted, extremely well-prepared legal briefs submitted against Tony Blair, for instance, and all those who were involved in the assault on the people of Iraq in 2003. So the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the so-called coalition of the willing was fully within the mandate of the International Criminal Court to investigate. What did the prosecutors do? Nothing. They just shoved it aside. So that there's a movement in the African Union to simply leave the International Criminal Court en masse. And that's what's going to happen, I tell you. If this court, not the prosecutor, he's already done what he had to do. He has requested arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Leyen. But imagine that the judges cop out, do not issue an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, but do issue arrest warrants against the Hamas leaders. That would be the last nail in the coffin. That would just completely take all authority and credibility away from the court. And I am a believer in the International Court of Justice. I am a believer in the International Criminal Court. I'm a believer in strengthening the system of international courts and tribunals. And I want really that they be professional. We were professional in the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. When I was head of petitions, I did not filter anything. Whenever I had a petition, a complaint against a state, whether it was a Western state or an African or Latin American or Asian state, that got processed. But that's not the case necessarily in these very highly political levels. And you've heard that our firebrand senator, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, had a meeting with Anthony Blinken to propose bipartisan sanctions against the court, against the International Criminal Court, because they have dared, to even put Netanyahu on a possible list of war criminals. Again, this is also a problem of perception. I don't doubt that Lindsey Graham actually means it, that he really thinks that Netanyahu is the good guy. I mean, if you have been subjected to brainwashing all of your life, what do you expect? Of course, people think this way unless you stop and say, what nonsense is this? I mean, who is the victim and who is the perpetrator? It's quite clear that the Palestinians are the victims and Israel is the bully. It's quite clear, except that if you've told otherwise, you know, if the press continues telling you that the Palestinians are all terrorists, so you put a label of terrorism on the Palestinians, and they're the bad guys by definition. So the other guys can do anything they want. And what you have in Israel is a failed project. Zionism was an interesting 19th century idea that survived through the First World War and the Balfour Declaration, but it is ultimately colonialist. The idea of Zionism is to establish a colony in a territory that was fully inhabited. It's like the Europeans who went to South Africa and established their colony. And for centuries, they controlled all the Africans in South Africa and in Rhodesia and in Uganda and in Kenya, etc., etc. They were the elites. And of course, the Africans were the cheap labor, as we have it in Israel today, that you have a situation of inequality, a situation that has been condemned by the United Nations General Assembly hundreds of times. And even my then president, Jimmy Carter, he published this book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. He published this 2006, and he was hit badly in the press because of it. He also published this wonderful book, We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land. And there's someone else who's published a very interesting, very provocative book, was this Professor Virginia Tilley. Virginia Tilley with the one-state solution. Of course, a one-state solution means forget apartheid and forget Zionism, because Jews and Palestinians would be equal. Imagine that. Just for as an intellectual exercise. Yeah. Imagine the idea that Israelis would have to live side by side with these Untermenschen, because it is very similar to the Nazi ideology. The Israelis consider themselves, without a doubt, superior, racially superior to the Palestinians. They look down on the Palestinians. They humiliate the Palestinians. And if you had a one-state solution, that would be, well, the end of the privileged class in Israel. But we're not there yet. I mean, Ireland just recognized the state of Palestine. That makes it now 148. I understand that Slovenia is going to be next. And then will be 149 out of the 193 states of the United Nations that recognize Palestine. So that is moving ahead, and there's no question that the Palestinians have a right of self-determination, but they also have a right to reparation. I mean, they have been subjected to apartheid, they have been subjected to ethnic cleansing, they have been subjected to evictions and confiscation of their properties and their olive groves, etc., etc. There's a big debt to be paid to the people of Palestine, and I'd like people to start thinking about it. I mean, even if the court, even if Israel now stops the war in Gaza, the genocide has already occurred. That doesn't erase the crime. 36,000, and it may be much more, dead Palestinians, to say nothing about all the Palestinians who are maimed and traumatized for the rest of their days. I mean, the responsibility of Israel for this war and for the prior wars. Who remembers Shabra and Shatila and all the other crimes committed? So that is going to come back. The chickens are coming back to roost. Just keep that in mind.
Okay, Professor de Zayas. Well, it's absolutely formidable and admirable, your initiative to hold the these leaders in high office to account and to hit them with a potential prosecution for war crimes. It's long overdue, considering the decades of oppression in the Palestinian territories, but also in other parts of the world where wars have been conducted rampantly and with impunity. Can I just finish, Professor de Zayas, with a question on Ukraine? Now, you've put forward a very a very workable, feasible peace formula for to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. It's a 10-point peace plan, and I will put a link to it when this interview is published. Now, in that 10-point peace plan for Ukraine, one item that you call for is for the halting immediately, well, a ceasefire, but also a halting of the supply of all weapons, armaments into that country. Now, the NATO powers, the United States in particular, Germany and Britain especially, have funneled something like, $100 billion worth of weapons into that territory over the last 2 years. And a case could be made, and I'm going to ask you, really, can a case be made that countries that are supplying weapons of that scale into this conflict, they are also guilty of inciting crimes against peace? They are guilty of, instigating war. And could they be also prosecuted for their reckless, insane arms supplies into a conflict which could turn into a nuclear conflagration? So let me just recap my question. Could a case be made that the United States, Britain, Germany, etc., could be held liable for instigating crimes against peace?
Well, the International Court of Justice could make such a determination with regard to the states. Now, as far as the leaders of the states, the individuals, they would be criminally liable before the International Criminal Court. And certainly Biden and Blinken and Rishi Sunak and Macron and Scholz are all guilty of complicity. And the complicity is so obvious because the massive nature of this delivery of weapons, of lethal weapons to Ukraine that have artificially prolongated the war. I mean, the war could have been avoided in 2014 if Ukraine had observed the Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and 2. It could have been avoided in 2021 if Jens Stoltenberg had decided to sit down with the Russians and negotiate on the basis of 2 treaties that are public. I can send you the links. 2 treaties on a European security architecture that would take into account the interests of the Ukrainians, but also the interests of the Russians. Now, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter is very clear in prohibiting not only the use of force, but the threat of the use of force. And the NATO expansion to the very borders of Russia and the clear policy of surrounding Russia, of putting, missiles, things that would endanger existentially Russia, just around Russia. They also wanted to do it in Georgia. Don't forget the NATO meeting of 2008, when that's the first time that they said Georgia and Ukraine should enter NATO. Well, NATO is, if you read the statute of the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg, 1945, Articles 9 and 10, that's a criminal organization. And if you apply the same criteria for Nazi criminal organizations condemned in the Nuremberg judgment of 1946, you will find that NATO fits the category. That is, NATO started as a legitimate defense alliance, but it morphed after 1991. Gradually, NATO morphed into a criminal organization that threatens the rest of the world, even with nuclear annihilation, and keeps expanding, even wants to expand into Asia. Imagine NATO somewhere in Japan or in Singapore, and nobody needs that. We have a security system under the United Nations Charter, and the NATO cannot usurp the functions of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and that is what NATO is trying to do. And it's being supported by all of these leaders. Yeah. And it's being supported by the echo chambers of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN.
Professor de Zayas, you know, a case could be made for the mainstream media being complicit in war crimes, couldn't it? I mean,
of course. But we already have jurisprudence. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda established solid case law on the responsibility of the media and responsibility of individuals in inciting the genocide in Rwanda. And those principles established by the court in Arusha could be applied very easily here. And there is incitement against Russians. I mean, the level of hatred. I mean, we have a culture of hatred in the West, unfortunately. The level of invective that you read in the New York Times and Washington Post when you're talking about Putin or you're talking about Lukashenko, et cetera, is unadulterated hatred, which also carries over to the cancel culture against artists like Valery Gergiev, the great conductor who's now conducting in the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, against Anna Netrebko, one of the best sopranos of the century, et cetera, being banned from performances. So it is part of incitement, yeah.
And dare I say, Professor de Zayas, the cancel culture would extend to people like you know, a Western citizen, citizen of the United States and Cuba, if I'm correct.
Correct. And Switzerland. I'm a very proud Swiss citizen.
But I mean,
just voted in the.
You're on the cancel culture list to take out your voice, because it is quite a, you know, it's such a crucially critical and powerful voice to speak up for the voiceless and expose the criminals in high office, which you're doing. And by way of, I'm going to have to finish. We're running out of time, Professor de Zayas, but thank you so much for such a lively and enlightening discussion, and it's given myself great heart that there can be such a thing as justice to prevail, and thank goodness there are people with your expertise and eloquence who are fighting the good fight. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank all the students in Ireland and in England and in France and in Switzerland who are demonstrating, and in my alma mater at Harvard University, when during the commencement exercises, there was a big demonstration, free Palestine, free Palestine. One last word, a word for Aaron Bushnell. I'll never forget the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. I think that example, that sacrifice, that immolation is something that the press doesn't want to know anything about. But here you have a young man, 26, who takes his own life to try to alert the world at the genocide, at the barbarity that is happening in Gaza, and where he says, I know that my suffering is going to be excruciating, but the suffering of the Palestinians is much, much worse. Of course, I'm a practicing Catholic, and I've had several masses said for the soul of Aaron Bushnell, and your listeners in Ireland and elsewhere, please pray for the soul of Aaron Bushnell.
Professor de Zayas,